February 15, 1944. The morning sky above central Italy roared with the sound of engines. Hundreds of American B-17 flying fortresses and B-25 bombers filled the horizon, their contrails weaving white scars across the blue. Below them, perched high on a rocky peak, stood the Abbey of Monte Cassino, a monastery that had endured for more than 14 centuries. Within hours, it would be gone. The first bombs fell just after 9 a.m. The ground trembled as tons of explosives tore through stone walls and ancient frescoes. Flames leapt skyward, smoke billowed into the valley, and centuries of sacred history collapsed into rubble. Civilians and monks who had taken refuge inside were buried beneath the ruins. Soldiers on both sides, Allied and German, stopped in stunned silence. A place of prayer, once untouchable, had become a casualty of modern war. For Allied commanders, the destruction was meant to clear a path through the Gustav Line, the formidable chain of German defenses stretching across Italy. Monte Cassino, towering 1,700 feet above the Liri Valley, commanded the approach to Rome. To them, the monastery was a suspected German fortress, an eagle's nest from which paratroopers observed every Allied move. The decision to bomb was presented as military necessity. Yet in truth, no German combat troops had occupied the abbey before the bombardment. For months, the German High Command had forbidden its use, fearing the propaganda backlash if the Allies destroyed such a cultural treasure. Ironically, the decision to reduce it to rubble handed the German Fallschirmjäger, elite paratroopers, a perfect defensive position amid the ruins. The sacred ground became a fortress after the bombs fell. Eyewitnesses captured the moment with horror and disbelief. One Allied soldier later recalled watching the monastery disintegrate. It was like the end of the world. The mountain shook, the sky turned black, and when the dust cleared, nothing remained but jagged stone. Monks who survived the bombardment remembered their centuries-old home vanishing in clouds of fire and thunder. To Italian civilians, it was not just a military strike, but the death of heritage itself. The Abbey of Monte Cassino had been more than a building. Founded in 529 AD by Saint Benedict, it had survived Lombard invasions, Saracen raids, and even Napoleon's armies. Within its walls, generations of monks had preserved the knowledge of antiquity, copying manuscripts and keeping alive the flame of Western learning. Now, in a matter of hours, the legacy of 1,400 years had been reduced to smoking rubble. On the battlefield below, soldiers absorbed the shock in different ways. To weary Allied infantrymen, who had been battered for weeks against the Gustav Line, the sight of the abbey collapsing seemed a grim promise that progress was at last possible. To the German defenders, it was both a tragedy and an opportunity. A paratrooper later explained, "Before, the monastery was useless to us. After the bombing, the ruins became our strongest fortress." The destruction of Monte Cassino symbolized more than the clash of armies. It encapsulated the brutal reality of the Italian campaign, a war fought village by village, mountain by mountain, where culture and humanity were often sacrificed to military expedients. It was here that the Allies' desperate drive toward Rome collided with the Germans' iron determination to hold Italy at any cost. But the bombing was only the beginning. Monte Cassino would not fall in a single blow. It would take 4 brutal offensives, spread across 5 months, to break the German line. Each would demand immense sacrifice from soldiers drawn from every corner of the Allied world: Americans, British, Indians, New Zealanders, French, and Poles. Each would test the endurance of the German paratroopers, whose skill and ferocity in defense would make Monte Cassino legendary. As the smoke cleared on that February morning, the abbey lay in ruins, but the mountain stood defiant. Monte Cassino was no ordinary battlefield. It was a crucible of war, a place where faith, history, and flesh were ground together in fire. The battle for its heights was only beginning. The ruins of Monte Cassino were not born in isolation. They were the product of a wider struggle that had engulfed Italy after the collapse of Mussolini's regime in July 1943. With the dictator deposed and Italy surrendering to the Allies, The war in the Mediterranean entered a new and brutal phase. Hitler moved swiftly to secure the peninsula, determined that no easy road to Rome would be granted to his enemies. At the center of his plan stood Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, a commander of great skill and composure. Tasked with holding central Italy, Kesselring understood the terrain better than most. Italy's geography offered him a natural ally, a rugged spine of mountains, deep river valleys, and narrow passes that made large-scale maneuver nearly impossible. By exploiting the land itself, he could turn the peninsula into a fortress. From this vision emerged the Gustav Line, a chain of interlocking defenses stretching 100 miles across the Italian waste from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic. Anchored on Monte Cassino, it was the strongest barrier in a system of lines designed to delay the Allies at every stage. Barbed wire, concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and fields sown with mines transformed villages and mountains into killing grounds. German paratroopers, mountain divisions, and armored units rotated into these defenses, creating a network that would cost the Allies dearly with every mile. For the Allied command, the task ahead was daunting. British General Harold Alexander, overseeing the campaign, and American General Mark Clark, leading the U.S. Fifth Army, confronted a nightmare battlefield. Winter rains turned roads into rivers of mud. The swollen Rapido and Garigliano rivers blocked easy passage, while the Apennine Mountains loomed as walls of stone. Soldiers who advanced found themselves climbing cliffs under fire, wading through icy water, or dragging artillery across terrain barely passable for mules. The strategy clash was clear. The Germans fought a defense in depth, retreating from one fortified line to the next, exacting maximum cost for every step forward. For Hitler, time was the true prize. Every month spent in Italy delayed an Allied invasion of France and tied down divisions that might otherwise face Germany in the west. Kesselring's orders were explicit. Rome must be held as long as possible, no matter the price. For the Allies, progress came in blood. The victories of Sicily and Salerno had raised hopes of a swift march to the Eternal City, but reality proved harsher. Casualties mounted quickly. One American soldier described the campaign in his diary. "It is not like fighting in Africa or France. Every hill has to be taken twice. You reach the top, and the Germans are waiting on the next ridge." German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, grew confident in their mountain bastions. A paratrooper later wrote, "Our defenses gave us the strength of 10 men. The mountains fought with us, and the Allies could not break them." With every failed attempt, Allied frustration deepened. Morale sagged as soldiers fought in freezing rain, their boots rotting in mud, their advances measured in yards rather than miles. At the heart of this stalemate stood Monte Cassino. The abbey and the mountain it crowned commanded the Liri Valley, the only direct route to Rome. Whoever held Monte Cassino held the key to central Italy. To bypass it was impossible. To storm it meant immense sacrifice. Both sides knew that the battle for Italy would be decided here, on a rocky height where history and strategy collided. As 1943 turned to 1944, the Gustav Line had become more than a defensive barrier. It was a symbol of German resolve and Allied determination, a clash of wills that would grind armies into exhaustion. And looming above it all, the monastery waited, its walls soon to be shattered by the storms of war. The Gustav Line had revealed its strength, and by mid-January 1944, the Allies resolved to crack it open with force. Their focus turned to the Rapido River Valley, a narrow corridor where the U.S. II Corps prepared to advance. On paper, the plan seemed straightforward. Cross the river, punch through the German defenses, and open the road toward Monte Cassino. In reality, it became one of the most costly failures of the Italian campaign. The task fell to the 36th Infantry Division, a unit composed largely of National Guardsmen from Texas. As they moved into position on January 20th, the men confronted a nightmare. Winter rains had swollen the Rapido into a swift, icy torrent. German engineers had mined the approaches, while barbed wire and interlocking machine gun nests waited on the far bank. To cross meant wading chest-deep under fire, dragging boats and equipment through mud thick enough to swallow men whole. At dusk, the Texans launched their assault. Almost immediately, German artillery zeroed in. Shells erupted along the banks, blasting men and rafts to pieces. Those who made it into the river found themselves swept away by the current or cut down before reaching the opposite shore. Survivors recalled the chaos. The water was red with blood. We tried to push forward, but the fire was too heavy. Men fell all around us. A handful of platoons clawed their way across, only to be pinned down in shallow ditches on the German side. Trapped without armor support and cut off from reinforcements, they fought desperately through the night. When dawn broke, German Fallschirmjäger counterattacked, rolling grenades and unleashing machine gun fire at point-blank range. Few escaped. By the end of the assault, the 36th Division had suffered catastrophic losses. More than 2,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in just 2 days. The banks of the Rapido were littered with bodies, equipment, and shattered rafts, grim testimony to the futility of the attack. Meanwhile, in the mountains surrounding Cassino, other U.S. units struggled to gain ground. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against them. Every ridge was mined, every slope covered by German mortars and snipers. The Fallschirmjäger, seasoned paratroopers hardened by years of combat, turned each hilltop into a fortress. A German defender later remarked, "We held the heights like eagles. They climbed, and we pushed them back. It was the mountain itself that fought for us." For the American soldiers, the experience was demoralizing. The cold was biting, rations were scarce, and artillery fire never ceased. Men dug shallow foxholes in rocky soil, only to see them collapse under rain and shellfire. A soldier wrote in his diary, "The days blur together in mud and smoke. You advance 100 yards, and you leave half your company behind." By the end of January, it was clear the first battle for Monte Cassino had failed. The Rapido crossing had ended in disaster. The mountain approaches remained firmly in German hands, and the monastery loomed above it all, unbroken and untouchable. American commanders faced not only the loss of men, but the bitter truth that brute force alone would not shatter the Gustav Line. The first assault had shown the Allies what they were up against: a fortified position of extraordinary strength, defended by some of the most determined troops of the war. The price was thousands of lives, paid for little more than scorched riverbanks and ruined villages. Monte Cassino would not fall easily. And so, as January turned to February, the Allies began preparing for their next move, a decision that would bring fire from the sky and forever change the fate of the ancient monastery. The first Allied assault had ended in bitter failure. The Gustav Line held firm, and Monte Cassino stood untouched, its white walls looming high above the valley. To many Allied commanders, the ancient abbey seemed the very heart of German resistance. Rumors spread through the ranks that German paratroopers were using the monastery as an observation post, guiding artillery fire onto Allied positions. Whether true or not, frustration and desperation drove a fateful decision. On the morning of February 15, 1944, the skies above Cassino filled with the drone of engines. More than 250 American bombers assembled overhead, their contrails streaking the cold winter sky. Below, monks, civilians, and wounded Italian refugees huddled inside the monastery's thick stone walls, believing that the sacred site would remain inviolate. It had stood since 529 AD, rebuilt and preserved through centuries of wars, invasions, and natural disasters. Few imagined it could fall in a single day. At precisely 9:30 a.m., the first wave descended. Hundreds of tons of explosives rained down in thunderous succession. The ground shook like an earthquake as ancient stones split apart, cloisters collapsed, and priceless manuscripts were reduced to ash. Clouds of dust and fire rose into the sky, blotting out the sun. A monk later recalled, "The walls shook, the earth opened beneath us, and centuries of prayer crumbled into dust." From the valley floor, Allied soldiers watched in stunned silence. Some cheered, believing the bombing would finally dislodge the Germans. Others stood quietly, uneasy at the sight of so much history being obliterated in moments. One American infantryman later admitted, "It was like watching a cathedral fall from heaven. We thought it would make the fight easier, but deep down, it felt wrong." When the bombardment ended hours later, little remained of the abbey but jagged ruins and smoldering rubble. More than 200 civilians who had sought refuge inside were killed. The monks who survived stumbled out into a valley that had fallen utterly silent, stunned witnesses to a cultural and spiritual catastrophe. The destruction of Monte Cassino sent shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. Around the world, newspapers condemned the attack, lamenting the loss of one of Europe's greatest treasures. And yet, the true tragedy was still unfolding. Before the bombing, German commanders had carefully avoided occupying the abbey itself, wary of violating its sanctity. But after its destruction, the ruins became perfect cover. German Fallschirmjäger, masters of defensive warfare, moved quickly into the shattered site, turning its broken walls and collapsed cellars into machine gun nests and sniper positions. What had once been a house of God was now transformed into a fortress of stone and fire. Irony hung heavy over the battlefield. By destroying Monte Cassino, the Allies had not eliminated a German stronghold, they had created one. Every collapsed wall became a barricade. Every crater became a firing position. The abbey's ruins offered better concealment than its intact walls ever had. Allied troops soon discovered that the price of erasing history would be measured in blood. In the days that followed, artillery duels thundered across the valley. Smoke lingered over the mountain like a funeral shroud, and the ruins of Monte Cassino loomed as both a symbol of destruction and a fortress of defiance. For the Allies, the decision to bomb the abbey would remain one of the most controversial moments of the war in Italy, a choice born of desperation, carried out with overwhelming force, and remembered for its tragic irony. The monastery was gone, but the battle was far from over. The Allies would soon launch their second offensive, determined to seize the shattered mountain that now stood as both a military obstacle and a haunting reminder of war's cost. The ruins of Monte Cassino still smoldered when the Allies launched their next attempts to break the Gustav Line. The destruction of the abbey had changed the battlefield, but not in their favor. German Fallschirmjäger, now dug into the shattered stones, were determined to hold their ground. February turned to March 1944, and the Allies threw fresh divisions into the inferno. The second battle began with British, Indian, and New Zealand troops pressing forward across the valley floor and up into the jagged mountains. The town of Cassino itself became the center of the struggle. Once a small Italian settlement of stone houses and winding streets, it was reduced day by day to rubble. Allied artillery and German counterbarrages pounded it into dust, leaving soldiers to fight through cellars, shattered walls, and streets clogged with debris. One New Zealand officer later wrote, "We no longer fought for houses, but for piles of broken stone." The Gurkhas of the Indian divisions attempted feats that bordered on the impossible. Scaling near vertical cliffs under constant fire, they crept up razor-thin ridges by night, armed with rifles, grenades, and the traditional kukri blade. Their courage was legendary, but even such valor could not dislodge the German defenders. On every crest, machine guns waited. Mortar shells rained down with unrelenting precision. For every yard gained, the price was measured in blood. German paratroopers fought with equal ferocity. Veterans of Crete and the Eastern Front, the Fallschirmjäger were among the most disciplined units in the Wehrmacht. They turned every ruin, every rocky outcrop, into a defensive strongpoint. A survivor later reflected, "Every stone became our ally. Every corner was a trap." From concealed positions, they fired into advancing Allied ranks, forcing repeated withdrawals. The town of Cassino was the worst of all. House-to-house combat blurred the line between offense and defense. New Zealand and Indian infantry fought in doorways, cellars, and stairwells, often reduced to grenades and bayonets when ammunition ran low. By March, Cassino was a corpse of a city, its church steeples toppled, its streets a maze of destruction. One Allied soldier remembered, "It was a place where time ceased to exist, just smoke, dust, and death. Artillery thundered without pause. Both sides pounded the town and hills, creating a moonscape of craters and shattered walls. The winter rains turned the valley into a swamp, bogging down vehicles and filling trenches with freezing mud. The wounded often lay for hours before they could be retrieved, their cries mingling with the echo of shells. Despite repeated assaults, progress stalled. The monastery's ruins, looming high above, mocked Allied efforts. Commanders grew increasingly frustrated. General Bernard Freyberg, leading the New Zealand Corps, insisted more bombing was the only way to clear the Germans out. Others warned that brute force alone could not overcome such defenses. Still, the attacks continued. By the end of March, the third battle had sputtered out. Thousands lay dead or maimed, and Cassino was nothing but rubble. The Allies had thrown some of their finest divisions into the struggle. British, New Zealand, Indian, Polish, and American units rotated through the lines, but the Gustav Line still held. The Germans had paid dearly in casualties, but their defense remained unbroken. For the men on the ground, despair took hold. Cassino became a symbol of futility, where courage was met with slaughter and every advance ended in failure. Allied soldiers wondered if the mountain could ever be taken. German troops, though weary, grew ever more confident that they could hold until the Allies bled themselves dry. The struggle for the hills had shown the world the true nature of Monte Cassino, a battle not of swift maneuvers, but of attrition, where mountains, weather, and ruins themselves became weapons. Yet the Allies were not finished. Another offensive would come, larger and more determined, one that would throw the full weight of multinational armies against the shattered monastery and the men who defended it. The long winter of frustration had given way to spring, but Monte Cassino still loomed, scarred yet defiant. The Allies knew that only a massive, coordinated blow could finally crack the Gustav Line. In May 1944, after months of bitter stalemate, that moment arrived. The plan was unprecedented in scale. Under the overall command of General Harold Alexander, armies from across the world converged on the valley. American divisions advanced on the western flank. The French Expeditionary Corps pressed through the Urunsi Mountains, while the British Eighth Army prepared another drive on Cassino itself. At the very center stood the Polish II Corps, commanded by General Władysław Anders. Men who had survived exile, Soviet camps, and years of displacement, now tasked with storming the most formidable bastion in Italy. On May 11, 1944, the final offensive began. At 11 p.m., over 1,600 Allied artillery pieces opened fire in unison. For hours the guns thundered, their flashes illuminating the night sky. Veterans compared it to the great barges of the First World War. The mountains themselves seemed to shake as shells rained onto German positions, turning trenches, bunkers, and ruins into firestorms. One Polish officer later recalled, "The earth itself trembled beneath our boots. It was as if all of Europe's anger had been unleashed on Cassino." When the barrage lifted, the infantry moved. Polish troops scaled the rocky ridges north of the abbey, climbing steep slopes under a hail of machine gun fire. The German Fallschirmjäger resisted with their trademark tenacity, turning every crater and ruin into a killing zone. Casualties mounted with horrifying speed. Companies were cut to pieces on the slopes, yet the survivors pressed on. The attack was not only military, it was personal. For the Poles, Monte Cassino represented a chance to prove themselves, to strike a blow for their occupied homeland. For days the struggle raged. Fighting was hand-to-hand in the gullies and ravines, with grenades, bayonets, and even bare fists used when ammunition ran low. German defenders, short of supplies but unbroken in spirit, counterattacked again and again. Still, the Allies pressed them higher into the shattered monastery grounds. On May 17th, the German commanders recognized that their position was untenable. Exhausted, cut off, and facing overwhelming artillery fire, they began a gradual withdrawal. The following morning, silence settled over the ruins where months of thunder had reigned. At dawn on May 18, 1944, a patrol from the Polish 12th Podolian Ulan Regiment reached the monastery. They clambered over the broken stones and raised a red and white Polish flag above the ruins. A bugle sounded the Hejnal Mariaki, the traditional Polish call. Across the valley, Allied soldiers paused, watching the flag ripple in the mountain winds. It was more than a victory. It was a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and the high price of freedom. The Gustav Line had been broken. In less than 3 weeks, Rome would fall to the Allies. Yet the triumph came at staggering cost. More than 55,000 Allied soldiers had been killed or wounded in the 4 battles for Monte Cassino. Among them, over 4,000 were Poles who had fought with unmatched determination on that final climb. German losses were equally heavy, with tens of thousands dead, wounded, or captured. For those who survived, the memory never faded. One Polish veteran later said, "When we raised our flag, we thought not of glory, but of those who would never see it." The ruins were ours, but the price was written in blood. Monte Cassino was finally conquered, but the mountain stood as both a victory and a graveyard. The Allies had shattered one of Germany's strongest defensive lines, proving that no fortress was unassailable. Yet they also left behind a landscape of ruin, stones steeped in history, now scarred by war, and fields filled with the fallen. The battle was over, but its legacy was only beginning. The guns finally fell silent, but Monte Cassino remained a mountain of ghosts. What had begun as a sacred abbey and a quiet town ended as a graveyard of nations. More than 55,000 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded in the 4 battles fought there, alongside tens of thousands of German casualties. The town of Cassino itself was reduced to rubble, its civilian population scattered, its streets and homes erased under months of artillery and bombing. The ancient Benedictine monastery, once a beacon of faith and scholarship for over 1,400 years, lay in shattered ruin. And yet, out of this devastation came a hard-fought triumph. The fall of Monte Cassino opened the road to Rome, captured on June 4, 1944. Strategically, the victory broke the Gustav Line and forced the German 10th Army into retreat. Symbolically, it lifted the morale of Allied nations, proving that even the most stubborn fortress could be broken. For the weary soldiers who had survived, it was both vindication and a bitter reminder of the cost of progress in the Italian campaign. For Poland, the battle became legend. The sacrifice of General Władysław Anders II Corps, thousands of men who had fought far from their homeland, etched Monte Cassino into Polish national memory. Songs and poems celebrated their courage, while memorials rose to honor the fallen. Many Poles believed their flag over the ruins was not just a military achievement, but a statement of national existence, a reminder to the world that Poland still lived, even in exile. One veteran later reflected that Cassino was our battlefield, our graveyard, and our proof to history. For Germany, Cassino stood as a demonstration of defensive brilliance. Kesselring's forces, particularly the elite Fallschirmjäger, had held the Allies at bay for months, inflicting heavy losses despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Their stubborn resistance delayed the Allied advance and proved once more the formidable skill of German troops in mountainous warfare. Yet even their tenacity could not change the course of the war. Cassino became not a triumph, but the last stand of a fading strategy, another step in Germany's long retreat from southern Europe. The destruction of the abbey remains one of the battle's most haunting legacies. Historians still debate whether its bombing was necessary. Before February 15, 1944, no German troops had been stationed inside its walls. But after the bombardment, its ruins provided perfect cover for German defenders, making the Allied task even more costly. To many, the abbey's destruction symbolized the tragedy of war, a priceless monument to European culture erased in hours, leaving only charred stones where centuries of history once stood. Today, the rebuilt abbey stands once more on its mountaintop, but beneath its foundations lie the echoes of war. Cemeteries around Cassino hold soldiers from Britain, America, New Zealand, India, France, and Poland, their graves a testament to the global scale of the battle. In the Polish cemetery at the foot of the mountain, thousands rest beneath simple white crosses, their sacrifice honored in solemn silence. Monte Cassino was more than a battlefield. It was a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and the price of liberation. It was proof that victory could be won, but always at a terrible cost. The bombs that fell on February 15, 1944, had turned stone to dust, and by May, blood had turned soil to mud. What remained was a mountain forever scarred, a place where faith, culture, and human life had all been consumed by the fire of total war. The echoes of Cassino endure. They remind us that every triumph in war is shadowed by loss, and that even in victory, what remains are ruins. Ruins of cities, ruins of monuments, and ruins of human lives.